It started as an ordinary shift at the hospital, but by the end of the day, one nurse's life would change forever. Sarah had always been the kind of nurse who treated every patient with kindness, no matter their background. To her, it wasn't just a job. It was a calling. She believed that every human deserved care, dignity, and respect. But little did she know, one simple act of compassion would cost her everything. That morning, Sarah had just finished checking on her patients when an elderly woman slowly walked into the emergency room. Her clothes were tattered, her hands trembled, and she clutched a small handbag as if it contained everything she owned. She wasn't loud or demanding. In fact, she barely spoke above a whisper, but there was something about her, an air of a quiet dignity, even in her obvious struggle. Other staff members glanced at her, but didn't pay much attention. Some assumed she was just another homeless person, looking for a warm place to sit for a while. But Sarah saw something different: the woman's frail body, the exhaustion in her eyes, and the way she hesitated at the reception desk told Sarah that she wasn't there to waste time. She needed help. The receptionist, however, barely looked up. "Do you have insurance?" she asked flatly. The elderly woman hesitated. I don't," she said, her voice barely audible. "But I'm feeling very weak. I think something is wrong." Sarah watched as the receptionist sighed, already looking uninterested. "You'll have to wait, and without insurance, we can't do much." Sarah felt a pang in her chest. She knew hospital policies, but she also knew what it meant to be human. The woman's hands were shaking, and her breathing was uneven. She was clearly unwell. Without thinking twice, Sarah stepped forward. "I'll help her," she said gently. The elderly woman turned to Sarah, her tired eyes showing a glimmer of relief. Sarah guided her to a chair and started asking questions, checking her vitals while making sure she felt safe. It was clear the woman hadn't eaten in a while, and dehydration was taking a toll on her body. Sarah discreetly grabbed a cup of water and handed it to her. "You didn't have to do that," the woman murmured, her eyes welling up with gratitude. Sarah smiled. "Everyone deserves kindness." She continued her basic checks, and that's when she noticed something unusual. The woman's pulse was weak, her skin pale. It wasn't just exhaustion. Something was seriously wrong. Sarah's instincts kicked in. She knew if the woman didn't receive immediate care, she could collapse at any moment. But just as Sarah was about to call for a doctor, she heard a sharp voice behind her. "Sarah, what do you think you're doing?" She turned to see her supervisor, arms crossed, eyes cold. The entire room seemed to fall silent. "She's not checked in as a patient," the supervisor continued. "And you know the rules. No insurance, no treatment, unless it's life-threatening." Sarah took a deep breath. "I think it is life-threatening. She's showing signs of severe dehydration, and possibly something worse. We can't just ignore her." Her supervisor's expression didn't change. "That's not your decision to make. You're wasting time on someone who can't pay. Get back to your assigned patients." Sarah felt a wave of frustration, but she kept her voice steady. "If she collapses right here, in this waiting room, then what? Do we wait for that to happen before we care?" Her words hung in the air. A few other nurses exchanged uneasy glances, but no one spoke up. The supervisor's face darkened. "I'm warning you, Sarah. This isn't your call." Sarah clenched her fists. She had spent years dedicating her life to this work, and now she was being told to turn a blind eye to someone in need. She looked back at the elderly woman, who was watching the exchange with silent worry. Sarah made a choice. She wasn't going to abandon her. "I'm calling a doctor," Sarah said firmly. Before her supervisor could respond, she turned on her heel and hurried to find a physician. But as she walked away, she couldn't shake the uneasy feeling creeping into her gut. She had done the right thing, so why did it feel like she had just signed her own fate? What happened next would shock everyone in that hospital and change Sarah's life forever. Sarah moved quickly, her heart pounding as she searched for a doctor who would listen. Every second counted. The elderly woman's condition was worsening, and Sarah refused to stand by and watch her suffer. But even as she hurried down the hallway, she couldn't shake the feeling that she had just crossed a line she wasn't supposed to. She found Dr. Patel, one of the more experienced physicians on duty. He was reviewing a patient chart when she approached him. "Doctor, I need you to check on a patient in the waiting room," she said urgently. Dr. Patel barely looked up. "Has she been admitted?" "No," Sarah admitted. "She doesn't have insurance, but she's showing signs of severe dehydration and possibly something more serious. I really think she needs immediate attention." Dr. Patel sighed, rubbing his temples. "Sarah, you know the protocols. If we make an exception for one, we'll have to do it for everyone. That's not how the system works." "But she's not just another case," Sarah insisted. "She's alone, she's weak, and I don't think she has much time." Something in her voice must have struck a nerve, because Dr. Patel finally looked up, studying her face. He had known Sarah for years. She wasn't the kind of nurse to overreact. If she was this adamant, there had to be a reason. "All right," he said, placing the chart down. "Let's take a look." Relief flooded Sarah as they made their way back to the waiting area. But as soon as they arrived, she felt her stomach drop. The chair where the elderly woman had been sitting was now empty. Panic set in. She quickly scanned the room. Had she left? Had someone forced her out? Then she spotted a small commotion near the restroom. A security guard was standing over the frail woman, who had collapsed on the floor. Sarah rushed forward. "What happened?" "She just went down," someone in the crowd murmured. Ignoring the whispers, Sarah knelt beside the woman, gently touching her shoulder. Her skin was cold and clammy. "Ma'am, can you hear me?" The elderly woman's eyes fluttered open, but her gaze was unfocused. Her breathing was shallow, her lips pale. "She needs immediate care," Sarah said firmly, looking up at Dr. Patel. Dr. Patel hesitated only for a moment before nodding. "Get a stretcher. We're taking her in." The moment the woman was wheeled into the emergency area, the atmosphere in the hospital shifted. Nurses whispered, doctors exchanged glances, and Sarah could feel the tension thick in the air. She knew what they were thinking. She had broken the rules, but she didn't care. Hours passed as the medical team worked on stabilizing the woman. Blood tests, IV fluids, a full evaluation. Everything she had been denied at first was now finally being done. Sarah stood by, watching through the small window in the door. She still didn't even know the woman's name, but she knew she had done the right thing. Then, just as she was about to step away, a voice behind her made her freeze. "Sarah, my office, now." It was her supervisor. Sarah turned, already bracing herself for what was coming. She followed her supervisor down the hall, past the nurse's station, and into a small windowless office. The door closed behind them with a sharp click. "What were you thinking?" The words were cold, controlled, but laced with anger. Sarah met her gaze without flinching. "I was thinking about saving a life." Her supervisor shook her head. "You went against protocol. You ignored a direct order. You put the hospital at risk." Sarah exhaled, trying to keep her voice steady. "And what if I hadn't? What if she had died right there in the waiting room? Would that have been better for the hospital?" Her supervisor's jaw tightened. "That's not the point." Sarah let out a short, bitter laugh. "Then what is the point?" to turn away the people who need us the most, to let them suffer because they can't afford help. For a moment, there was silence. A flicker of something, guilt maybe, crossed her supervisor's face, but it disappeared just as quickly. I don't have a choice, Sarah. You forced my hand, she said finally. Sarah's stomach twisted. She had been expecting this, but that didn't make it any easier. You're being dismissed, her supervisor continued. Effective immediately. The words hit like a slap. Fired. Just like that. Sarah swallowed hard, her mind racing. She had spent years at this hospital. She had sacrificed sleep, holidays, and time with her family, all for this job, for the patients who needed her. And now, because she had chosen compassion over rules, it was all being taken away. She could have begged. She could have apologized, promised to follow the rules from now on. But she wouldn't, because deep down, she knew that if she had to choose between this job and doing what was right, she would choose the latter every time. With a final steady breath, she met her supervisor's gaze one last time. I'd do it again, she said simply. Then without another word, she turned and walked out of the office. What she didn't know was that this wasn't the end of her story. It was just the beginning. Sarah walked out of the office, her mind buzzing. Fired just like that. The halls of the hospital, once familiar and comforting, now felt cold and distant. Nurses she had worked alongside for years avoided her gaze. Some looked at her with sympathy, others with fear. Fear that standing too close to her would put their own jobs at risk. She grabbed her bag from the locker room, her hands trembling slightly. Was this really happening? She had spent years in this place, giving her all, only to be cast aside like she was nothing? All for doing what she knew was right. As she stepped out into the cold evening air, the reality hit her. She had no job, no backup plan, but she had no regrets. Just as she was about to leave, she heard a voice call her name. Turning, she saw a woman standing near the entrance. It took her a second to recognize her. It was the elderly woman she had helped. The woman looked different now. Though still frail, she seemed stronger, standing upright with a warmth in her expression. She had been discharged and was now dressed in clean clothes, her hair neatly brushed. I was hoping I'd find you, the woman said with a smile. I wanted to thank you. Sarah felt a lump form in her throat. You don't have to, she said softly. I just did what anyone should do. The woman shook her head. Not just anyone would have done that. She reached into her bag and pulled out a small envelope. Please, take this, she said. Sarah hesitated. I can't, please, the woman insisted. It's not what you think. Just open it. Sarah slowly took the envelope and peeked inside. What she saw made her heart stop. It wasn't money. It was a letter, one that bore the official seal of one of the largest healthcare organizations in the country. Confused? She looked up at the woman. I never told you who I was, the woman said gently. My name is Margaret Reynolds. Sarah blinked. The name sounded familiar, but she couldn't place it. Margaret smiled. My late husband built one of the largest non-profit medical foundations in the country. After he passed, I stepped away from it all. I wanted to see the world the way it really was. I wanted to know how people like me, without power, without money, are treated. Sarah's breath caught in her throat. I was ignored by so many people that day. Margaret continued. But you saw me. You helped me when no one else would. That means more than you can ever know. Sarah didn't know what to say. Margaret reached out and squeezed her hand. I have a position open at my foundation, she said. One that needs someone with your heart, your integrity. If you want it, it's yours. Tears welled in Sarah's eyes. Just hours ago, she had lost everything. And now, because she had chosen compassion over rules, she was being given an opportunity she never could have imagined. She looked at Margaret, then at the letter in her hands. For the first time since she had walked out of the hospital, she smiled. "I'd love that," she said. Margaret smiled back. "Then let's get to work." As they walked away together, Sarah realized something. Sometimes doing the right thing comes at a cost. But in the end, kindness always finds its way back.